I'm Doris Wise Montrose. I'm president of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors. I would like to take a minute to show my gratitude to those who have been very helpful in the success of tonight's event. First, my deepest gratitude to the Lux Hotel for always graciously providing CJHS with these lovely facilities. There's no question. They have a great spa weekend too. First, there is no question that without their generosity, CJHS as an organization would be unable to bring these kinds of events to the community, and we'd still be meeting in my living room. I thank the Horowitz Freedom Center, the Republican Jewish Coalition, and the San Fernando Valley Republican Club for distributing the invitation for this event to their respective lists. And a big giant thank you to all my friends who do all the behind the scenes work, check people in and just generally make me look like I'm really organized. Tonight we have the very special honor of hosting Carolyn Glick, one of the most brilliant journalists and thinkers of our time. I know that we are all anticipating her talk tonight about Israel and the upcoming U.S. election, probably the most important election of our lifetime and critical both to Israel and the United States. My very good friend Rick Richmond will introduce Carolyn. Rick edits the blog Jewish Current Issues. You will find his articles at Commentary Magazine and PJ Media. Rick's posts and articles are always highly analytical and meticulously discerning based on original sources and text. He manages to address current events with clarity as well as heart and even a wry sense of humor not found in the mainstream. Rick is a popular panelist participating on several events hosted by CJHS and will be a panelist at our next event on August 23rd right here, The Evolution of the Israeli Right from Jabotinsky to Begin to Netanyahu. Before we get started, we ask that you please turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices. And now I introduce you to Rick Richmond, who will introduce Carolyn. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I think we all recognize that we are at an important point in history, and I want to introduce Carolyn Glick by making a brief comment about the difference between history on the one hand and living through history on the other. With history, you know how the story turns out. You read it wondering how it all happened, fascinated to learn all the details, but you rarely are personally invested in the outcome. You already know it. On the other hand, when you're living through history, it's exactly the opposite. You're immersed in the details day after day, but you have no idea how it is all going to turn out. It would be nice to have a prophet on hand, someone who could tell you what's going to happen, except that is not the definition of a prophet, at least not in the Jewish tradition. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible specialize not in prophecy, but in first principles, knowing that if you paid attention to first principles, the future would take care of itself. And conversely, if you didn't, it wouldn't. The Hebrew prophets rarely predicted the future. More often, they excoriated the people about the present, applying first principles. Norman Podhoretz, in his book on the prophets, wrote that those who chose appeasement in the 1930s might not have done so had they remembered the warning against it by Jeremiah, who wrote, "They have healed by saying peace, peace, when there is no peace." Podhoretz took that warning forward, applying it to the new terror war against Israeli civilians, writing that Jeremiah's words blazingly articulated the dangers of pursuing peace when peace is not at hand, and warning against prematurely and unilaterally trying to make peace with an enemy who has not the slightest intention of making peace with you. This evening we are in the presence of two prophets in the deeper sense of that word. The first is the woman who daily reminds us that never again is now, and that phrase was intended not to be simply a slogan, but to have operational significance. Doris Wise-Montrose. Almost single-handedly, she has brought a series of speakers to us of surpassing importance, has established the important new internet venture MyEretz to support Israeli business while others boycott it, and has worked tirelessly to ensure that what her family and her people suffered will never happen again. And the second is Carolyn Glick. The words once applied by an Israeli colonel to Ruth Weiss of Harvard also apply to Carolyn. She is worth a battalion, because what we are engaged in is a war of ideas and a contest of moral stamina, no less than a physical conflict. She has displayed not simply physical courage, she was embedded with the U.S. troops in Iraq, but intellectual and social courage, taking positions that gain her no popularity with elite opinion and few invitations to their cocktail parties. She writes an indispensable column every week, has produced an indispensable book, and has just joined the David Horowitz Freedom Center as the director of its Israeli security project. Back in 1994, the great American writer Roger Shattuck listed his basic rules, and one of them was this: everything has been said, but nobody listens. Therefore, it has to be said all over again, only better. It is a great privilege to present to you someone who says what has to be said over and over again, and each time says it better. Carolyn Glick.
Wow. Wow, thank you. Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you very much, Doris, and thank all of you so much for coming and giving me that warm welcome to Los Angeles, California. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here speaking to all of you. And so far, it's been fun. So thanks. I got to tell you, I love those. That was quite a welcome. I really appreciate it. Okay. So the topic of my talk this evening is Israel and the U.S. on the eve of the U.S. presidential elections, 98 days from today, but who's counting? So I figure probably the best place to start is with presumptive Republican nominee for President Mitt Romney's visit this past weekend to Israel, and then move back a little bit. So yesterday, Romney was in Jerusalem, and he gave a speech in Jerusalem, and he was incredibly well received in Israel. And it's interesting in a way that he was so well received in Israel, because he didn't seem to say that much in his speech. I mean, we are used to American presidential candidates coming in and saying, I'm going to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem myself, January 21st, I'm there, and I'm going to start building it brick by brick, and whatever. They constantly are making these pronouncements, and Romney didn't do that. Romney did not do that. So why was he so well received? He didn't make any of the usual routine promises of a presidential candidate who is seeking the support of Israel supporters in the United States, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. I think that he was such a success because more than anything else, the underlying message of his speech in Jerusalem was that he lives in the real world. He lives in the world that is occupied by facts, by interests, by values, by developments, by people, and not in a fantasy land where pretend people and pretend interests and pretend values exist. And that was a breath of fresh air, because in the real world that we occupy, the Muslim world is extremely dangerous, and it's inhospitable to the United States and to Israel, to the values and national security interests of the United States, to values, national security interests, including the existence of Israel. In the real world, Israel is the United States' indispensable ally in the Middle East, and the stronger Israel is, the better defended U.S. national security interests are in the region. In the real world, the Arab Spring is actually not at all spring-like, but rather it's a very cold winter, and it's not an Arab Spring, it's an Islamic winter, where the worst forces in the Muslim world are being empowered at the expense of the forces that may not be positive, but at least are not as dangerous as the ones that are now being empowered in country after country throughout the Levant and North Africa. And that is the world that we know, that we've always known. That's the world that we've always occupied. And that's the world that we're living through today, and it's becoming more and more dangerous. And that's the world that Romney spoke of yesterday when he was in Jerusalem. And I think it's because he spoke of that world that, again, it was considered a deeply, deeply positive speech from an Israeli perspective, and I dare say from an American perspective. But now, why would that be such a breath of fresh air? What is the world that is being occupied by the Obama administration today? Why is it that the statements that Romney made in Jerusalem yesterday were such a sharp contrast to the ones that are being made by the present administration? So, unfortunately, what we've seen over the past 3.5 years since Obama took office is a U.S. policy in the Middle East. And I say the Middle East because that's the subject of our talk today, but really you could look at Latin America, say the same thing, Asia, say the same thing. But specifically in the Middle East, you have a foreign policy vis-a-vis the Islamic world that is based upon a fantasy, that is based upon a set of presumptions that don't exist in fact. One of them is that America's worst enemies can be appeased. Another one is that the Muslim Brotherhood, as the Director of National Intelligence said to the House Select Committee on Intelligence, is moderate, it opposes violence, and it's largely secular. It's funny, but it's not funny. It's devastating because this is a statement that was made by James Clapper, the head of U.S. intelligence, the Director of National Intelligence. And he didn't have his tongue in his cheek, he was serious. It's amazing. And in this fantasy world, it is Israel's strength that provokes its neighbors. And the way to moderate the Muslim world, to appease the Muslim world, is to put daylight between the United States and Israel, is to make it clear to America's worst enemies that America does not have Israel's back. And you do this by a series of actions as pertains to the Palestinians. You take their side against Israel at all times. You deny that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. You attack Israel repeatedly for allowing Jews to assert, to keep their property rights entitled to property that they own in Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and to build on the land that they own and that they have deeds to, simply because they're Jewish. And you attack Israel's government for not discriminating against Jews as Jews and allowing Jews to build on land that they own and to construct houses on land that they have license to build on. You have the United States of America under the Obama administration attacking Israel in the media through a series of leaks dedicated to undermining Israel's possession in the world and in in the United States public opinion, exposing what are supposed to be Israeli strike plans against Iran's nuclear weapons installations. You have the United States using the media to deter Israel from attacking and destroying Syria's chemical weapons arsenals that are now deeply, deeply threatening to Israel and to the region, with the Syrian government itself coming out and saying, we have chemical and biological weapons and we will use them against external enemies. That is, the Syrians are directly threatening Israel with chemical and biological weapons, and the response of the Obama administration is to say, we're going to get together a coalition, and we're going to have tougher sanctions on Assad, who is threatening Israel with chemical and biological weapons, and that Israel shouldn't act unilaterally. We have the Obama administration going after not only Israel, but U.S. allies throughout the world, around the Arab world, turning against Hosni Mubarak, who was the president of Egypt for 30 years, who maintained Egypt's peace, not perfectly, not even well for that matter, but didn't go to war against Israel, kept the Sinai border with Israel a border of peace for 30 years. For 30 years. And he was the anchor of the entire U.S. alliance system with the Sunni Arab world. And the Obama administration booted him out of power, knowing full well that when he left, the Muslim Brotherhood would come in. Why? Because it was the strongest force in Egypt after the Mubarak regime. So that once that regime was gone, there was absolutely nothing blocking the Muslim Brotherhood from taking power through democratic elections, because they are that popular. They are populists. And they hold the devotion of the majority of the Egyptian people. So he turned on America's most important ally in the Arab world, Hosni Mubarak, said, you have to leave now, not in September, not in an orderly fashion, but helter-skelter, now get out. It was a shocking thing. And why? Because he felt in his imaginary world, the reason that there is radicalism in the Muslim world, the reason there is a jihadist bent that is the strongest populist strain in the Islamic world today, is because the United States has behaved poorly. And that if the United States turns on its allies, and even on its own interests, and apologizes to its worst enemies, which is what he did on June 4th, 2009 in his speech in Cairo, then somehow or another things are going to get better. That is, by being bad to yourself, by weakening your allies and empowering your worst enemies, you're going to turn your enemies into your friends. And then, of course, there's the part of that that relates to the home front, which is that the Obama administration has systematically purged the vocabulary of the federal government of all the terms required to describe reality. So you're not allowed to use the word jihad. You're not allowed to use the term Islamic terrorism. You're not allowed to, in any way, shape, or form, describe reality through the use of words in the federal government today. All of the terms required to describe reality by federal employees have been banned. So abroad, you are pushing a policy that is based upon a fantasy that if you're horrible to your closest allies and apologize for your own country to your worst enemies, that somehow this is going to make you more secure, make your allies more secure, make your enemies decide not to be your enemies any longer. And, you know, in the mix, we have the whole issue of Iran and its nuclear weapons program that is openly It is an openly genocidal program where all of Iran's major leaders, all of their leaders, are on record calling for the annihilation of Israel, and they are building nuclear weapons. And yet, from the way that the Obama administration has been behaving since entering office, it has become abundantly clear that their Iran policy revolves around one thing and one thing only, not preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, but preventing Israel from acting militarily to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. That is the Obama administration's policy towards Iran. The sanctions, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said yesterday in Jerusalem, have not diminished one iota Iran's ability to move forward with their nuclear weapons program, not by one iota. For all the talk about strong sanctions, they have not impacted Iran's nuclear weapons program one iota. 20 countries, Iran's major trading partners, by the way, have gotten a pass from the Obama administration about their oil deals with the Iranians. They're allowed to continue purchasing petroleum from Iran. That has rendered Obama himself has given a waiver to all of these countries. So he himself has ensured that those sanctions that he continues to brag about will have absolutely no impact. And in the same time, he's conducting negotiations with the Iranians, whose only purpose is going to be to buy time for the Iranians to continue their nuclear weapons program on to completion. The point where today, I don't even know what to think of these reports any longer. They keep giving us timelines. So the new timeline is that, surprise, surprise, January 2013, Iran is going to become a nuclear power. They will have the independent capacity to develop nuclear bombs at will, right around the time of the inauguration of whoever wins the elections in November. So this is what we're seeing from the Obama administration, and I want to take just a second to go back for a second to what's happened in Egypt, because I think it bears noting. A lot of attention has been paid to Iran, and rightly so, because this is a threat of annihilation to Israel. But I think less attention has been paid to Egypt, and it is an immediately threatening situation for Israel, and it is a devastating situation for the United States as well, what has happened in Egypt, and it's received almost no press attention, certainly not the attention that a shift of this magnitude deserves and requires from the American people and from, of course, the U.S. media. Again, as I stated before, Egypt was, under Mubarak and before him under Sadat, it was the anchor of the U.S. alliance system in the Arab world, quite simply. And of course, because it is the most populous Arab country, 70 million people, and because it controls the Suez Canal, it is the most important strategic asset that the United States had in the Arab world. And it was the key to the U.S. alliance with the Saudis, or the maintenance of the U.S. alliance with the Saudis as well, because the Saudis are not a military power. Egypt is. The Egyptian military that has been developed since Israel signed the peace treaty with Egypt is a completely different military than the one that Israel barely beat in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. That was an Egyptian military that was run on inferior Soviet military platforms, MiG jets, Soviet tanks, and so on and so forth. Today, it's a completely different military. It's an Americanized military. All of the weapon systems are American. They make Abrams tanks in Egypt. They have their own production line. Egyptian pilots fly F-16s. They're trained by the U.S. Air Force. The Egyptian Navy is more powerful than the Israeli Navy. All American ships, all American munitions, all American missiles. Plus, Egypt, of course, had its own chemical weapons production. They used chemical weapons against the Yemenites in their war with Yemen in 1962. So they have a past of actually deploying and using chemical weapons in war. This is a very, very dangerous country. It was Israel's most powerful enemy until after the 73 war. And again, we barely won in the Sinai in 1973 at enormous cost in lives, and only with a massive U.S. airlift of arms were we really able to decisively win in the Sinai in 73. And again, that was with a much different Egyptian military. And you could make the case that Israel is also a much different military than we were in 1973, and that's true. But we're very similar to the Egyptian military today. And this military is now controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood. And a lot of people have been making the argument that it's not that much of a concern because the Egyptian military is still in charge of Egyptian foreign policy, and they just had that sort of diktat that they made on the eve of the presidential elections in Egypt last month, that they were going to retain control over Egypt's national security policy and foreign policy, and that the president wasn't going to have any powers in this realm. So that isn't true. And I'll explain, there are two reasons that that is not the case. The first reason that that isn't the case is because the whole rationale that the Egyptian military was operating under in terms of maintaining the peace accord with Israel was that that was what was required to ensure American support for the Egyptian military. Unfortunately, under the Obama administration, the U.S. no longer supports the Egyptian military. It supports the Muslim Brotherhood against the Egyptian military. So the reason that the Egyptian military had for maintaining the peace with Israel, that is U.S. support, is gone. They don't have American support any longer, and since they don't have American support any longer, they have no reason to uphold the treaty, and therefore they won't. The other reason that it isn't true is that in the event that, say that my first assertion was incorrect, which it isn't, it's correct, we have to understand, and I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago, that the position of the Egyptian military in Egypt from a constitutional perspective as well as from a societal perspective is far weaker than the position of the Turkish military and what they occupied 10 years ago when the Turkish equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Justice and Peace Party under Prime Minister Erdogan, won their first election. At that time in 2002, when the Justice and Peace Party, or Justice and Development Party, it was Justice and Development in Turkey and Justice and Peace in Egypt. Anyway, when that party won in Turkey, the Turkish constitution required the Turkish military to intervene with the politics of the country in the event that there was any threat to the secular nature of the Turkish Republic. So that when, in the past, the Turkish military intervened and overthrew elected Turkish governments because of the fear that they were Islamist, they did so because they were required to do so by the Turkish constitution. So it wasn't a coup d'etat in the way that we generally conceive of a coup d'etat, because they were required to do it. They were carrying out their constitutional responsibility when they overthrew the government. So they were extremely strong. They were in a very strong position then in 2002 vis-a-vis the AKP party when it came in. Today, 10 years later, half of the Turkish General Officer Corps is in prison. Half of the generals in the Turkish military are in jail. Most of them are sitting there without any charges against them. Many more of them are sitting there in trumped-up charges of treason based upon a mythological plot to overthrow the government called the Ergenekon plot, which is just science fiction. And together with them, sitting in jail, unindicted in most cases, are the journalists, are the businessmen, are all the pillars of a civil society that is non-Islamic, that is secular. And in charge of Turkey today is a Muslim government, a Muslim Brotherhood-aligned government. The AKP was the first government to embrace Hamas in 2006 after they won the elections to the Palestinian Legislative Council, and who have embraced, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who embraced Iran, which everybody here is erroneously saying there's no way that they're going to be working together because this one is Shiite and this one is Sunni, and they're really competitors. Well, they're competitors and they're collaborators. They're grown-ups, they know how to do both. And we keep saying no because we want to think for them. What we're constantly doing in the West, and particularly in the United States, is figuring out reasons not to be concerned about things that ought to concern us. And so, thanks. And that's really what's happening. So if this is the situation in Turkey 10 years down the road, what do you think is going to be the situation in Egypt? Again, the rationale for continued maintenance of the peace treaty with Israel is gone because of the Obama administration's decision to turn its back on the Egyptian military and prefer instead the Muslim Brotherhood. And two, the Egyptian military is far weaker constitutionally than the Turkish military was 10 years ago. And so from both of those perspectives, it's clear that they are not going to guarantee anything. And that what we have today in Egypt is a sea change of the magnitude of the communist revolution in China. And the strange thing is that after Mao Zedong won the revolution and turned China red, the United States was obsessed with the question of who lost China. Who lost China? Today, there's no question that the U.S. government lost Egypt, and yet nobody thinks that there's a problem with this, and nobody's asking that question, and nobody realizes that it's been lost. So, this is the kind of situation that we're facing today on the eve of the U.S. presidential elections, where you have an entire foreign policy establishment, really, in Washington and around this country, people who write about foreign policy, people who enact foreign policy, who are going willy-nilly down a garden trail that is going to lead to horrible, horrible events if it isn't stemmed by people who embrace reality as their operating assumption when they're moving into the world around us. So, just to go back to the beginning, what does this tell us about Romney's speech? And what was he saying in that speech? He said, Iran is dangerous and it can't be allowed to have nuclear weapons. At the same time that the Obama administration is enabling, essentially, that eventuality by continuing to have negotiations with the Iranian government, which can lead only to the acquisition of further freedom of action on the part of the Iranians to build and develop and complete their nuclear weapons program, and enacting sanctions that are not having any impact whatsoever on the Iranian nuclear weapons program. You have Mitt Romney coming to Jerusalem, and by the way, mentioning that it happens to be the capital of Israel, which was nice. He got a standing ovation, and everybody here is clapping. And Rick mentioned in his very warm and kind and flattering introduction what that writer that he mentioned, whose name I forgot, wrote in 1994. Well, George Orwell said that it is our job to repeat the obvious. But unfortunately, the obvious has become an applause line. That is the absurdity of the times in which we live, the topsy-turvy world in which we live, where to state the obvious fact that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel has become something that when a Republican candidate for the presidency of the United States says, he gets a standing ovation for. It's sort of, it was kind of nice and kind of disturbing at the same time when I saw that. It shows what a distance we've traveled. And he said that, and he said about Egypt, he said that Egypt is required to maintain the peace treaty with Israel, and if it doesn't, it must face a whole host of difficulties along the way, and that he claimed that the international community has enormous leverage over Egypt. I'd like to see some of that being exerted. So far I haven't, and I'm questioning the existence of such leverage. And again, one of the reasons that I'm questioning the leverage that the international community may exert against Egypt is because I see the European Union isn't even capable of recognizing the fact that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization the week after Hezbollah carries out a massacre of Israeli citizens on European soil. So, we're living in a very, very disturbing world. And unfortunately, that world is being led down a garden path by an American government that is insisting on denying reality, on preventing people from seeing reality by blocking all of the terms that you need to use in order to describe reality from the lexicon of the federal government. And so today, again, just mentioning basic facts has become an empowering statement for a politician to make, empowering to allies, empowering to audiences, empowering to friends. Just by stating the obvious, you are considered to be a friend today. Just by acknowledging the facts of life in the real world, you are considered to be a friend by people who live in the real world. So, I think I could end there, but I do want to make just a couple of closing remarks about the Palestinians, because I think that just to round out this sort of overview of where Israel is with the United States and in general on the eve of the U.S. presidential elections, I would be remiss if I didn't mention what's going on with the Palestinians. And I think it's also important because, another aspect of this attempt to run away, to escape reality is this insistence that Israel has become a synonym of the peace process. That is, it has no existence independent of negotiations with the PLO towards the establishment of a Palestinian state. That when you say that you support a two-state solution, meaning Israel plus a Palestinian state, that is, since Israel already exists, what the two-state solution actually is, that you support the establishment of a Palestinian state. And if you don't say that, then people like the folks over in J Street are attacking you and saying you're not pro-Israel. So the only way in this topsy-turvy world where you can be called pro-Israel or call yourself pro-Israel is if you support the establishment of a Palestinian state in Israel's heartland. That requires a priori the forced expulsion of 350,000 Jews from their homes in Judea and Samaria and up to 250,000 Jews from their homes in Jerusalem. How this has become a precondition for being considered pro-Israel is, again, beyond me. This is just a shocker. And yet you see J Street running ads against members of Congress like Joe Walsh from Illinois, Alan West from Florida, because they don't support the establishment of a Palestinian state. And so J Street is saying that they're anti-Israel. So, I think what we've seen in Israel over the past 20 years since the Oslo process has started is a wrenching exit from this world of fantasy. We were there. We were there first, in fact. Israel was in this fantasy land even before the United States. We started down this road in 1993 when we embraced Yasser Arafat and pretended black was white and white was black, and we cried peace, peace, and there was no peace on the White House lawn 20 years ago when he was embraced as a peace partner, and from then on. And we've had a process that has been very violent and very painful of shattered illusions. First, when the Palestinians rejected peace and statehood at Camp David in 2000, in July of 2000, and embarked on a terrorist war against Israel, the likes of which we hadn't seen since before the establishment of the State of Israel. And then again, after we forcibly expelled 10,000 Jews from their homes in the Gaza Strip and in northern Samaria in 2005, and were repaid by the Palestinians with a missile war that has reached the outskirts of Tel Aviv now. So these two events, these watershed events, have forcibly removed the Israeli people from fantasy land and have placed us back into reality. And we understand today, the majority of Israelis understand that this whole concept of a two-state solution is just not a solution, and it's a recipe for war. It will bring us nothing but war. And that we have to move on and think about other options. And it would be wonderful if, in fact, it would be cosmically, massively terrific if the United States doesn't have to go through that same process. Because if it does, it won't be 2,000 people who are killed, as has happened in Israel since 2000. It will be at a completely different dimension. And it would be terrific if instead of going through that kind of a painful process, that America can emerge on the other side simply by voting. So, thank you very much.